Bienvenue sur le podcast pour un plein épanouissement affectif et cognitif. Chaque vendredi, vous pourrez vous enrichir avec l'expérience d'éducateurs au sens large qui cherchent à contribuer à ce plein épanouissement. Des professeurs des écoles, des éducateurs Montessori, des chercheurs, des formateurs et même des rééducateurs. J'ai à cœur que l'école évolue pour que chaque enfant puisse développer son plein potentiel. J'essaie de faire ma part avec mes ateliers Montessori, mes formations en ligne et en présentiel, le podcast bien sûr, et mes 2 cartons dans l'éducation nationale. Pour résumer, au quotidien, j'aide les enfants à développer leur plein potentiel et j'accompagne des professeurs des écoles pour leur faire découvrir l'éducation Montessori, qui est en parfaite cohérence, adéquation avec les recherches en neurosciences. Vous trouverez plus d'informations sur mon blog, montessori-apprendreautrement.com et plein d'autres ressources. Si vous voulez recevoir gratuitement les clés les plus efficaces pour développer le plein potentiel des enfants à l'école et à la maison, vous pouvez vous inscrire en cliquant sur le lien dans les notes de l'épisode. Pour passer à la vitesse supérieure, vous pouvez vous inscrire à ma formation en ligne ou en présentiel. Vous aurez toutes les informations sur le blog. Si ce podcast vous plaît, je compte sur vous pour laisser un commentaire sur votre plateforme d'écoute et une note de 5 étoiles si vous êtes sur Apple Podcast. C'est la meilleure solution pour donner de la visibilité au podcast et contribuer vous aussi à cette révolution éducative. Et n'hésitez pas à partager les épisodes qui vous plaisent. Aujourd'hui, j'ai interviewé Barbara Oakley. Barbara est professeure d'ingénierie chimique. Alors en anglais on dit engineering professor. Je ne suis pas sûre que ma traduction soit la bonne. Barbara a réalisé un MOOC très célèbre, Learn How to Learn, sur Coursera. Et ce cours a été suivi par plus de 3 millions de personnes. Mais Barbara reste accessible et a répondu favorablement à ma demande. Donc cette interview est en anglais. Mais même si vous ne parlez pas beaucoup anglais, je vous invite à suivre son MOOC, parce que les vidéos sont en anglais, mais vous pourrez mettre les sous-titres en français. Ce cours sur Coursera vous apprendra énormément. Je vais vous mettre le lien dans les notes de l'épisode. Donc dans cet épisode, nous avons parlé de l'efficacité des métaphores, Diffuse mode and focus mode, la traduction en français c'est pas évident à traduire, du succès qui entraîne la motivation, de la mémoire de travail et de la mémoire à long terme, de Retrieval Practice, donc le fait de se tester, et encore plein d'autres sujets. Nous avons eu le temps d'aborder de nombreux sujets sur l'apprentissage. Je laisse place à ma conversation avec Barbara Oakley. Hello Barbara, it's an honor to speak to you today on the podcast.
Oh, Celine, I am very, very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I took the 2 courses on Coursera, Learning How to Learn. I read the book for teenagers and I started listening to Mindshift. All of that.
That's a lot.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
And I think, I understand you didn't like math at school, but now you are an engineering professor. Do you agree to start with your own experience as a learner?
Yes. Would you like me to share a little about my experience as a learner?
Yeah.
I think you have a better experience than I am because your English learning has come fantastically over the past year.
But you learned Russian. You learned Russian when a few years ago.
Yes, quite a few years ago. So you are exactly right. I did not like math and science, and I certainly did not do very well when I was in elementary, middle, and high school. And I just thought, I can't do this kind of learning. So I enlisted in the army to learn a language. So I studied Russian. I should have studied French, obviously. Such a beautiful language. But I did learn Russian. It took a year and a half. But then I found to my amazement that although I had done what everyone had told me to do in following my passion and learning a language, actually I was being selfish in doing that because I was only doing what I wanted to do and I wasn't looking at what the world needed. So if I had been smarter, I would have balanced my own desires with also the desires for what the world is really looking for. Because when I was going to get out of the military, when I was age 26, I found that that I had put myself in a career box, that I didn't have many job opportunities. And then, as even more nowadays, there are many opportunities opportunities if you are also able, whatever your passions are, if you're also able to include some knowledge of analytical sorts of skills, that can be a really good um, yeah, a good opening for the kind of career that will allow you to what we say call your own shots. In other words, you can think about or you have more control. If you don't like a job, you can quit it more easily and have more ease in finding a new job that you like. If you don't have a lot of career options available for you, then you don't have that kind of flexibility, and sometimes you have to work for people you don't like, doing work you don't like. So at any rate, at age 26, I decided to see if I could open my brain a little bit more and start learning in math and science. So to my surprise, I did. I was successful. But I now know from neuroscience that the reason I was successful was that I applied some of these ideas about language learning to learning in math and science. And many of the ideas that allow you to more quickly and more easily um, think in a foreign language can allow you to also more quickly and more easily think in the language of mathematics, think in the language of coding, these kinds of things. Uh, so I was really surprised at the underlying commonality of the neuroscience of learning, and we can often do much more than we think.
It's really interesting. And I heard you saying it's a good idea to broaden our passion.
That's right. We're always told follow your passion, which means kind of like whatever you already like, just keep doing that. Well, that's not necessarily a good idea, because if you like something a lot, there are pretty good chances, there's a good probability that other people, many other people, like what you like a lot, which means that when you go out into the job world, you don't have anything really special that differentiates you from other people. Because if you train in the same thing as, like, most people, many people, including me, are very interested in psychology. But what that means is if you specialize and you get a degree in psychology, you're competing with all the other people, tens, hundreds of thousands of people with degrees in psychology. And how do you differentiate yourself? A, a good way to do it is to broaden your passions. Don't, I mean, learn some psychology, but balance that by learning in kinds of things that typical psychology students often are not studying. And it's a good idea to keep in mind. So, what are employers looking for? Um, if you balance with something employers are looking for example, coding skills, um, it may not seem really exciting or sexy to be doing coding, but when you really begin to understand it, you understand it's like a fantastic game of mental chess. And it is exciting. And what's even more exciting is that it's really nice to have a good job. And if you don't like that job, you can go get a different one. That's pretty cool too. So broaden your passions. Keep keep different career doors open, and try to make sure that you're looking not only for what you want, but what the world is wanting.
All right, it's a really good advice. And I've never heard neuroscientists in France or Canada talk about diffuse mode and focused mode. And for my French listeners, can you please explain these two modes to them?
Oh, okay. Well, so uh, there are two major ways that the brain works. One is when you are focusing carefully on something. And this type, when you're focusing, psychologists call this mode of operation the task positive set of networks. So you're focusing on, for example, solving a math problem or writing an essay in French or in English. So you're focusing. The other way of thinking engages a much broader set of networks in the brain. And this set, I call it diffuse mode because it kind of indicates it's all spread out. But psychologists call it the task negative network. In other words, it's a network that arises when you're not doing something, so there's no tasks going on. And neuroscientists call it the default mode network. And indeed, this whole idea of the discovery that there are two different modes of learning came about because several different researchers, among them prominently was Marcus Raichle, found they were always having their subjects do something, like do a math problem. Imagine playing part of a musical instrument. Look at this picture. So they were having them doing these tasks. But then they suddenly noticed that when they'd say, okay, now wait here while we get the next task ready for you. Well, while they were waiting and doing nothing, their brain was off doing something completely different. It had this very large set of connections that suddenly appeared. And it turns out that when we are kind of relaxing mentally and letting our mind wander, that we go into this diffuse mode or default mode network. And it can happen when we're going out for a walk, say, or we might be having a cup of tea or falling asleep at night. Any of these kinds of activities can help us to activate this diffuse mode network, which is where a lot of our creativity arises from that much broader network. We can't focus in and solve a particular problem, but we can kind of get a new perspective so that when we return to our focus, we can actually make progress on difficult problems that we're trying to solve or concepts we're trying to understand.
That is really interesting. So I'm wondering, my husband runs 3 times a week, but during this run, he listens to a podcast. Does this prevent him from being in diffuse mode?
Well, yes and no. It depends on what the podcast is. If the podcast is like doing intense mental math, totally prevents him from getting into. But it's probably something it's kind of easy to listen to and just gives you some thoughts. Is
It's
that
in
more
English.
like?
It's in English, so he has to concentrate to stay focused.
Oh yeah. Well, he's using some more of the focus mode, um, but while let's say he's getting ready to go running, he's in diffuse mode because he's not really focusing on things. He's just kind of getting his shoes on, getting those things ready. While he's concentrating on the podcast, he's probably not diffuse mode. But when he's done, he's so even 30 seconds or a minute or two can help you. And also, whatever you have previously been focusing on, if you get your attention off it and you're focusing on something else, such as he's doing when he's on you're listening to the podcast, that does help sort of at least give your brain a little bit of a rest. But these little moments where you're switching to new tasks and things like that, those are often kind of empty moments, and the diffuse mode can pop up at those times.
Okay, it can be short.
It can be short. Longer periods of diffuse mode can be helpful if you're just really letting your brain relax, or you really want to kind of allow your brain to kind of think in the background about issues. For example, there's so many great writers who had what they would do is they would go for long walks. And during those walks, they wouldn't necessarily be focusing on exactly some topic, but while they were walking, ideas would come to them about their writing. And Darwin himself made a lot of his breakthroughs through his walking habits.
Okay, and as soon as we have a free moment, we take out our phone to answer messages, to scroll through social networks, or to test ourselves with our flashcards. Would it be judicious during these few minutes here and there to do nothing in particular, to be in diffuse mode, as you said?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you are in focus mode all the time, the more you try to focus all the time, it can gradually suppress that more creative diffuse mode. There's some evidence that this happens. And so indeed, it's difficult to know for sure. But for example, when I go to Asian countries, I am often told we have really bad difficulties with creativity. That's a major problem. But when you really look at how they approach their learning, they have such respect for the learning process, but they think of the learning process as only involving focus. So this means that much of their day is when they're learning is focus, focus, focus. When they might take a break, they might do focused mode meditation, which means they're still focusing. So it's all of this focus all the time. It's kind of, as they say, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And so building in little moments of mental rest and relaxation is really, really important for the creative process, and also to help you integrate what you've just learned. You're not conscious of it, but taking 5 minutes of a break where you're not focusing on anything, you're not looking at your phone, you're not looking at a keyboard, you're looking out a window or making a cup of tea. Those little breaks will allow your sort of the middle parts of your brain and your hippocampus to take a break and offload information. So you're actually learning even though you think you're doing nothing.
All right. I work with middle school students to enable them to learn how to learn, and to reduce their false beliefs about the brain, and to enable them to be more successful. Some are more motivated than others. Is there a way to act on their intrinsic motivation?
Oh, that's a really tough one, because it really does need to come from inside the student. But at the same time, I need to make an important point. When kids go to ride a bicycle, they can see the older children riding bicycles, and they want to ride a bicycle, even though it hurts when you fall off. It hurts to learn to ride a bicycle, and yet kids they will go through all sorts of things to ride a bicycle. A lot of what children learn, like in math, and maybe even learning a foreign language if you're not living in that country, it's a mental sport. And you can't see the other kids out riding, the mathematical bicycle, to inspire you. So it's something that's very mental. And so for a lot of kids, it's hard to see, what's the use of this? I'm not motivated because I don't see the use of it. So that's where good teachers can, all you need to do is that day inspire them to do a little bit. The next day, inspire them to practice a little bit. The next day, and each day may be a struggle. And you may say, well, I'm not getting the child to love to do this themselves. Well, even the best neural researchers on motivation and how to keep focus struggle themselves with motivation and keeping focus. So it's okay if kids have these troubles. That's what we're there for as teachers, as parents. And sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit because when you just nudge a child to do, a little math practice every day, you think, oh, I'm not doing anything. But day by day, you are building something. And what happens is it's like you're building this little mountain and you put a little, a little scoop of sand, and it doesn't look like it's growing. But when it gets a little bigger, all of a sudden it begins to become easier to build that little hill of knowledge. The more you know, the easier it becomes to add more knowledge. So you just have to get the kids past that point of, oh, it's boring, I don't like it, I don't see the point. Just keep going. And then it's like learning to play a musical instrument. Oh, I don't like it, I don't want to do it. Yeah, I'm bad at that, blah blah. Oh, that sounded good. Oh, and then with math or with coding. Oh, you mean this is all I need to do to make, oh, this algorithm works. And then they begin to motivate themselves once they get past those initial hurdles. So give yourself credit as a parent or teacher if you just keep them going through those slow initial learning how to ride the bike, falling off stages until they can get to see the mental beauty of what they're doing.
Are you saying that success drives motivation?
Yes. So we often think that motivation drives success, but usually it is the other way around. Once you become successful, then you become motivated. So that's where we need as teachers to just keep them going along through the harder things until they begin to see the beauty. And they almost always will.
Okay. And what is deliberate practice? Is it the same as retrieval practice?
So those are two different concepts, although they're related to one another. So when you learn anything, you are creating sets of links in long-term memory. So, and I say that when you learn anything, because you can think you've learned something. Like you look at a list of vocabulary words of a foreign language and you go, I got that. And then you get the test and you're like, I didn't get that. Because you had them when you looked at the piece of paper, you had them in a temporary part of your brain called working memory, which is just where you temporarily can, like if I told you, remember the number 29435. Well, you'd probably repeat it for a little while, but in 5 minutes, if I asked you what that number was, you'd forget because it's only in your working temporary memory. But if you really practice with something, you actually create sets of links in long-term memory in the neocortex, which is scattered all over your brain. And the way to strengthen and to know for sure you got links in long-term memory, not that short-term working memory, is to try to pull it to mind. If you read a piece of paper or read a page in a book, look away and say, what was the most important idea in that book or on that page? Or if you are looking at flashcards, well, that's why we have flashcards. So you can look at the word in French and then see if you know what it is in Spanish. You're testing yourself. You're retrieving it from your own brain. And that strengthens those sets of links. Now, deliberate practice, on the other hand, it's the idea that for us to learn effectively, we need to just not be reading things and and doing easy stuff that we already know pretty well. It's the idea that we want to push ourselves on the edge of what is most difficult for us. Oftentimes, that can involve retrieval practice. Because if you think about it, you're reading a difficult page of a book. Now you look away and you say, what was that key idea I just learned? That's really focusing on the hardest thing that you've just been doing. So you are doing deliberate practice even as you do retrieval practice. On the other hand, if you have a stack of flashcards that you know really well and you flip through them, that's easy stuff. You already pretty well know it. That's not really deliberate practice. That's retrieval practice of the easiest stuff, which is not going to advance you very quickly.
Ah, I get it. Thanks. And during the course for teenagers, you use a metaphor with a mouse. I'm not sure I understand this metaphor. I used to compare our synapses to a path in the forest. At first, we need to cut through the branches to clear a path. If we follow the same path several more times, it becomes easier and more well-worn. But if you don't use the path often, the vegetation will grow back. Does this have the same meaning as your mouse metaphor?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That is what I mean by the mouse metaphor. So, the first time a mouse runs through heavy grass, it kind of has to push its way forward. But once that mouse has run through that same path in the grass before, oh, it starts to get a little path there, and it can go really quickly through that path because it's gone on that pathway so many times before. So that is the same exact analogy.
Okay. And why metaphors are so effective?
Because when you're learning something, you create these sets of links, and it's hard to create a set of links about a brand new concept. So when you get those sets of links, let's say that you're learning something new. So let's say you learn how water flows. As adults, we think it's water flow, it's easy. But when you were a baby and a little kid, you did not understand how water flow worked at all. I mean, that's why babies, they play with water. You watch little kids and they just, yeah, they get all excited and because water, they're just kind of having fun with it and figuring it out. Once you get the main idea that water flows along, it seems relatively easy. But it wasn't really easy when you were a baby to really understand all those things. Anyway, as an adult, if you are learning how electrical current flows, the electrons, in some sense, flow along just like water molecules do. So it's a lot. If I just had you understand, if I tried to explain electrical current flow, I mean, think about the very word we're using, current. That's the same word that we use for water, current. And so you automatically get this sense of, oh, I think that must be kind of like water flowing along. But if, let's say, I couldn't use any metaphor at all, I would just say, well, let's see, uh, the electrons will move according to the derivative as shown by this calculation right here. You wouldn't have really as good of an intuitive feel for what electrical current is doing at all. Now, you might say, oh, but I know my electricity, and I know that at quantum levels, it all breaks down. Water is not a good analogy, and in fact, for electrical current flow. Well, yeah, that's right. But at superficial levels, it gets you on board with key ideas much more quickly. So metaphors tell you what are some of the key ideas that are the concept, what are some of the key ideas that are not the concept. For example, electrical current is flowing in a wire. It's not flowing way down the road, it's flowing in a discrete channel. Oh, that's just like water. So there's a lot of things like, that our analogy helps us understand what electrical current is, and also what electrical current is not. And so this is related to a concept called neural reuse theory. And it's, in essence, we're using some of the same neural circuits that or connections we've made to understand one concept to help us much more rapidly acquire the main ideas about a new concept.
That is really interesting. And speaking of metaphors, I love the metaphor of the backpack and the locker. Can you explain? Can you explain what is it about? What it is about?
Okay, so a backpack, you can kind of think of it. So we've talked a little bit about working memory, which is a little bit of information that your mind can hold temporarily, but it falls out pretty easily. A locker is more like, so working memory is like a backpack. You could only fit a little bit of information into a backpack. And whereas a locker is for school children to put lots more materials into, and it's more like long-term memory. In fact, it's almost like a miracle long-term memory, because it's not just what's in the locker, but you can open the locker door and the locker is huge. It can hold anything you want almost in that locker. So if you're able to get something into long-term memory, it will stay there for a long time. Maybe your only issue will be, I've got all this stuff in the locker. Where do I find the information I'm looking for? But that's sort of the difference. Backpack is like, you can hold a little information, you can carry it around with you, but things fall out of your backpack pretty easily. But on the other hand, a locker can hold, especially our magical lockers, can hold much, much more information.
The magical one, okay.
Yeah.
And I don't think you talked much about flashcards in the online course. However, if I had to recommend just one tool, I feel that it should be this one in order to test ourselves. It's so powerful for me, and I'm wondering, is it so effective, flashcards?
Oh, yes. Flashcards are very, very effective because they make use of retrieval practice. So, flashcards are exceptionally effective, I believe, for language learning. So, because we're having to learn so many new vocabulary words. But I think they can also be of great use in learning in physics, chemistry, mathematics. We're often discouraged from remembering things by heart the way we do. If we're learning a language, we have to memorize these terms, and the words and so forth. But then with Western reform education, it's often, oh, no, 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 you don't need to memorize this equation. Don't pay attention to them. Poets will often say, memorize the poem and you will understand it more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we let the poets have all the fun? If you're learning in math and science, it also can be really helpful not to just memorize an equation but actually look at it and think about it as if it were a poem. So you're actually, why does this multiply this? Why is that dividing that? Where's the exponent? Why is that there? If you will memorize or internalize some of these key equations and internalize how to solve key problems, you will actually learn these ideas much better. So, like I used to use flashcards, so I would have a question on one side of the flashcard, and I would get it so that I didn't just sit there and memorize these solutions to the equation or the problem. I would say, okay, I'm looking at it on one side of the flashcard. Now, let's see, what's the first step I take to solve this? Okay, what's the next? And I would see if I could if I could solve that in my mind. First, I'd always do it on paper to make sure I wasn't cheating myself, but I would make it so that I could look at a problem and it was like a song that would unfold in my mind. Oh, I do this, yeah, and then the next step is this and this, because I had solved it so many times when I was practicing that I was retrieving it from my own mind, that retrieving how to do all sorts of different kinds of problems became very easy. And it helped me develop an intuition that if I'd look at a certain type of problem, I know I need this kind of approach as opposed to that kind of approach.
So flashcards are very effective because we use retrieval practice when we use them. That's right?
Yes.
And we can use flashcards for problem solving and to memorize by heart. Both.
Yes. And remember that whenever you are memorizing by heart, you are always doing everything you can to understand why you're doing it, at least at first. Once you've got the understanding, you don't need to keep saying, oh, I do this because of this. I do this because of that. You just help it so that it becomes natural and fluent.
Okay. And rereading and highlighting are two strategies that teenagers use a lot. They are not very efficient. What other strategies are more effective?
So the most effective strategy by far is retrieval practice. So we can fool ourselves into thinking that if we underline words on the page or we reread words on the page, that it's going to help us learn. If you read carefully one day and then you reread carefully a day or two later, so you've had time to think about it, that can be helpful. Or maybe you're reading a very difficult paragraph and you have to reread it a couple of times to figure out what are they talking about. That's okay. But what we don't want is you read the chapter and then you read it again and your eyes flow along it and you think, I know this stuff, but it's tricking you. It's only going in working memory, not long-term memory. The only way to get it in long-term memory is using retrieval practice and these kind of deliberate practice techniques. So and ask yourself, especially if you're learning a language, try to do it so that you are as much as possible as if you are with a native speaker. So a native speaker can throw anything at you at any time. So it is, in essence, it's like what we call interleaving. It means you have concepts that are somehow connected, but you don't really know when the concept is going to come at you. So interleaving or mixing up, closely related sorts of ideas helps you to become faster at what you're learning and to become more intuitive. So this is true for language learning, but it's just the same for learning in math and science. If somebody gives you a bunch of calculations for how to calculate the perimeter of various of circles, well, you can easily say, I can calculate the perimeter. Sure, that's so easy. I've done it a million times. But interleave it with other concepts it could be confused with. So, for example, don't just calculate perimeter, calculate area, calculate the volume, calculate the surface area. So all of these things, you want to kind of play with them around the same time. So you don't, because when you get a test, they're not going to say, for this problem, you will use the calculations for perimeter. They will expect you to figure that out. So you want to, as much as possible, mix things up, interleave them. And textbooks do not present things this way. They'll be like, Okay, here's section 4 on perimeter calculations, and here's 15 problems on perimeter calculations. And by the end, you're thinking, I've got this, but it's actually not true. Because if you start mixing up with these other types of calculations, and of course, bringing it back around to language, you can think you know present tense, in English really well. Well, you could you only really know present tense if you can also mix it in with past tense, with future tense, with all these different tenses. That's when you really begin. So don't allow yourself to be fooled by thinking, oh, I know present tense. But then when you start mixing it in with these other tenses, you find you didn't know it as well as you thought.
The example you gave in math, I read the same kind of example in an article wrote by John Dunlowski.
Oh yes, he is a brilliant master of the best techniques that we know of to help students learn. And he wrote with his colleagues an outstanding paper on sort of like what students really need to do in order to learn effectively. So he's a superstar.
Okay, and we can't end this episode without talking about the Pomodoro technique.
Oh, that's such an important technique. So I teach a course, Learning How to Learn. It's one of the world's largest massive open online courses. We've had well over 3 million students. And I can tell you without a doubt that people's very favorite technique from this course is the Pomodoro technique, which I give gracious thanks to Francisco Cedillo, who is an Italian who devised this technique back in the 1980s, although we now know from neuroscience of today why it's so very effective. So the Pomodoro technique is very simple. You just get rid of all distractions, no pop-ups on your computer, nothing popping up on your cell phone. If you have a little brother, good luck with stopping that distraction, but do your best to get, to move aside all other sorts of distractions. And then just set a timer for 25 minutes, work as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. And that means that if your mind goes, oh, I have to be doing this other thing, make a note, but keep your focus for those 25 minutes. And when you're done, relax for 5 minutes. And you can do this 2, 3, 4 times, and then take a longer break, like half an hour or something like that. But those little 5-minute breaks are really important because that allows you to get into diffuse mode. It helps you to get away from cognitive fixation about ways of looking at what you're learning that may actually be slowing you down. So in any case, the Pomodoro technique is incredibly valuable, not only for learning, but for productivity as well.
Okay, thanks. And would you like to share something that happened recently that made you grateful?
Oh, that made me grateful. I am very grateful. Tomorrow I will get a new knee. So I will be able to walk without my leg hurting, and that will be incredible. I mean, just think about it. 50 years ago, if you had your knee go out, that was just that, and you just sort of couldn't walk very well for the rest of your life. Or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, you get your leg kind of busted up in a battle, and too bad for you. But I can go in and they will have me on my feet tomorrow afternoon after surgery. I am deeply grateful.
I wish you good luck for tomorrow.
Oh, thank you very much.
And do you want to share a quote and a book?
A quote and a book. So, let's see, which one do I go? I'm terrible at remembering quotes, so I will just don't just follow your passions, broaden your passions. second quote is by Winston Churchill, which is, "There's something about the outside of a horse which is good for the inside of a man," which nowadays would be translated as good for the inside of everyone. I love horses. And I think, there's so many books. So one of my favorite of all time is about Genghis Khan, called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, by Jack Weatherford. So it's a fantastic book. Another book by Peter the Great, about Peter the Great by Robert Massey. There's the Book of Why by Judea Pearl, about causality and how to model causality. Very recently, I read The Cattle Kingdom, which is a really interesting book about cattle in the U.S. between the 1850s or so and 1900, and that was like the U.S. Silicon Valley of the time. It involved cows instead of chips. So anyway, those are just a few books.
Okay. Thanks, Barbara. It was so great to talk to you and talk about this subject.
Oh, Celine, it's my pleasure. All I can say is your learning is going great. So listen to Celine; she's learning fast.
I can't thank you enough for this great interview.
Oh well, thank you. And I'm sorry for the. So, thanks again.
Si ce podcast vous a plu, je vous rappelle que je compte sur vous pour laisser un commentaire sur votre plateforme d'écoute et une note de 5 étoiles si vous êtes sur Apple Podcast. C'est la meilleure solution pour donner de la visibilité au podcast et contribuer vous aussi à cette révolution éducative. Et n'hésitez pas à partager les épisodes qui vous plaisent. À la semaine prochaine!